Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we have a Sicilian Defense, and I go for my a3 line that I love so much, and my opponent goes knight f6. So we're not going to be able to get any of the gambit lines. And we have a couple of options in this position. So firstly, we can of course play the move e5, attacking the knight, kind of like is it Alekhine's defense, I think, with e4 knight to f6. And after knight to d5, there's a multitude of things we can do from that position. We can play d4, we can play c4, we can even play bishop c4. That's not completely ridiculous. Alternatively, we could play knight to c3 and prepare the move e5 while already controlling the d5 and e4 squares, meaning this knight would have to retreat to g8. Now, on knight to c3, my opponent could do a few things. He could go d6, stopping e5. The move that I'm more concerned about, or potentially concerned about, is the move d5, striking in the center. And if e5, knight to e4, that's potentially difficult to evaluate. However, I think knight to c3 is still a good idea. And we'll see what happens. I think d5, we also have a couple other options than just advancing the pawn. We could take, and after knight takes, we could play a move like bishop to b5 check, which actually looks pretty decent, because there's no bishop to d7, I don't think. I think the knight might hang. Although it's a little bit of a complicated position. There's like bishop, like knight here, bishop to b5, bishop to f4. And there's a lot of complications there. But we don't get that. My opponent instead goes for d6. And now what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to play this in more of a Vienna sort of fashion. Now, you should always be aware, when your knight and your bishop are like this, your opponent does have the potential to take on e4 and then play the move d5, forking your pieces. This is like commonly known as the center fork trick, and normally it occurs after e4, e5 positions. Here, however, we can always meet knight to e4 with taking on f7, or even better, after d5, like after the taking on e4, knight e4, d5, we always have bishop b5 check to bail us out, but worth being aware. So my opponent goes g6, I'm going to go d3, and we're going to get a position that we have had this, I think, exact position in some of the previous episodes of the speed run, where technically this is a Sicilian defense. But you'll also notice that this is also being played in a Vienna fashion. Of course, the pawn is not on e5, so we don't have the tension between the f4 and e5 pawns. But it's very much a Vienna-esque position. And I like to play this line. You can't play it against absolutely everything. It is, of course, depending on what your opponent does. And there are a few caveats, like e6 is playable in these lines to try and play d5, where, of course, if you were in the Vienna, this pawn would be on e5 already, so there would be no e6, d5 ideas. Although sometimes there's c6, d5, but that's beside the point. And what one of the main plans is in this position for the white pieces is let's maintain our light squared bishop. If my opponent does try to go for this plan, we will tuck our bishop on a2 and justify the move a3 by putting the bishop on a2. Because, of course, we have spent a whole tempo playing the move a3. We're going to castle kingside. And what we will likely do is try to rotate this knight into the g3 square and then play the move f5 at an opportune moment. We might even put this knight on h4 to provide more support. And we will try to play the move f5. Yeah, this pawn is on e6, so we're going to drop the bishop back to a2. This is an important move because the issue is we probably want to meet d5 with e5, keeping the center shut. Now, of course, it's a very common chess principle where when you're attacking, you want to keep the center shut. And of course, we're not attacking just yet, but you can see how my pieces are beginning to line up against the black king, right? It's clear that I want to attack my opponent on the king side. So I want to be able to keep the center shut. However, if d5, I don't have time for e5 because my opponent will take the bishop, I will take the knight, he'll probably take back, and then I'll take back. And that position just isn't great. My pawn structure is pretty much ruined, and I don't want that. I don't want the center to open up in that manner. So by playing bishop to a2, I can always meet the move d5 with e5, boot this knight to a square like d7, and then we can, you know, maybe bring our knight back, and we can start to rally the forces, and again, begin the attack. This bishop often reroutes to b1, and these pawns come to like c3, d4, but my opponent goes bishop d7, which is just a developing move. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I'm just thinking, yeah, no, this is fine. Knight to e2. Sometimes in these lines, you have to be a little bit aware of the move c4. Now, normally that occurs when b5 is already on the board, supporting c4, because your opponent can try and break apart your central control and go after the e4 pawn. Because, of course, our knight was previously defending it, now it is no longer defending it. But what we're going to do, we're going to bring the knight to g3. Now this pawn is adequately defended. I'm expecting maybe bishop c6. No, okay, my opponent pushes. He goes for d5, and like I said, we will meet that with e5. Blocking off this bishop, also blocking off this diagonal for the light squared bishop in the future, and just keeping the center shut. Of course, our bishop is also suffering as a result of the center being shut down like this, but in the long run, this should benefit us. I mean, you should already start to see how the black position is starting to get pretty cramped. Like, this is not a fun setup for black to be playing. And most likely, black will try and lash out to get out of this position, maybe with a move like f6, but we will see. And now, I think I like the plan of c3 and d4, just taking a massive center. I also don't really want to allow my opponent to play d4, and maybe try and maneuver a knight into like the e3 square, or any shenanigans like that. I also don't want d4 in conjunction with bishop to c6, opening up this diagonal, which can be very annoying in some of these lines. Should also be worth noting that we have to be keeping an eye on this diagonal. But because black's pieces are so inactive, there's no harmony. There's no harmony. Because let's say this knight got to g4, then queen b6 ideas would be a little bit more scary. Because one, if c4 was played, he'd have a good grip over e3. Obviously, he'd be delivering a check. And if king to h1, he would have a move like knight to f2. The knight and the queen would work in harmony. And if I move my king, I'm actually getting smothered mated, most likely. You'll know that pattern if you know what I'm on about. But I will probably just have to give up my rook for the knight, and that's not something that I want to do, of course. So, okay, my opponent goes rook to c8, which makes sense, activating the rook. And I don't see an issue with playing the move d4. Now, a move I would... Okay, let me ask you a question. Do you think c4 is a good move? I would say absolutely not. That is horrific. Because black closes off a lot of his counterplay on the queen side. He probably will have to try and make the move b4 work. And, of course, like I said, my attention is towards the king side. And a closed center benefits the attacking side. And if he were to have played c4, that would have been the most close center you'd have ever seen, right? Okay. If you're enjoying the video so far, by the way, please drop a like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And my opponent goes bishop to b5, hitting my rook. A very simple threat. I think rook to f2 is perfectly reasonable. This diagonal is no longer weak because this pawn is, of course, in the way. And this pawn is very well defended. I like the move rook f2 for two reasons. One, I maintain control of the f-file. There is potential for me to play f5 at some point. And secondly, I also defend c2 and b2. c2 because maybe the rook will try to infiltrate. I don't really want to allow that. And b2 because there's a very, very strong chance this queen comes to the b6 square, trying to apply general pressure to my position. And I would like to be able to move this bishop somewhere without having to worry about leaving behind the b2 pawn, again, to a potential queen to b6, as an example. So, by putting the rook on f2, my bishop no longer has the responsibility of defending b2, and it can go off and do something else, right? Queen b6 played, I'm going to go bishop to e3. I think this is a very nice move. And what I effectively want to do is over-defend the d4 pawn, right? Meaning that any of these pieces can go and do something else if they're required somewhere else. I'm, of course, just developing my final minor piece as well. I'd probably like to bring this rook to c1 to challenge this rook. I also have the option of doubling up rooks if I desire, and that's also why rook to f2 is a good move. Like I mentioned, we control the c2 square. My opponent does go f6, as I anticipated several moves ago, because otherwise, how are you fighting against this e5 pawn? I'm, of course, not particularly scared of this move. It doesn't really do anything scary. Of course, if I take, then I need to be a bit worried because I lose control of the f6 square. But I can just let my opponent do this, and that's not a problem. So I'm going to challenge the rook on c8 because that's probably black's best piece. And then, by bringing my rook to c1, I also open up the possibility of bishop to b1, because maybe this will be a more fruitful diagonal for the bishop than this diagonal. I'm in no rush, but it opens up the opportunity. With the rook on a1, it's more difficult to play bishop b1 because I don't want to trap my rook in the corner of the board. I'd like it to get into the action, maybe trade itself off. Let's say like rook takes, queen takes. I'm preparing a move like rook to c2 and I will dominate the c file. And then again, yeah, my bishop can come to b1. Maybe it will trade itself off for this bishop, or maybe it will prepare to, I don't know, take a knight on f5 or apply general pressure to the position. By playing the move f6, you should be aware of the fact that e6 is significantly weakened. I think taking with the queen is definitely the more natural move. I don't see a reason to take with the bishop. Okay, and my opponent takes on e5, which I would say is a bold move. We'll see how he justifies it. Now, taking with the knight doesn't make sense to me. The knight isn't hitting anything important, and we simply lose control over f6 and allow this knight to get back into the game. So I'm going to take with one of the pawns to maintain my domination over this knight and my domination over this bishop. Question is which pawn? Now, typical wisdom would say take with the f pawn. For 1, taking towards the center is typically a good thing. 2, what was the second one? Oh yeah, we prevent a passed pawn from being created. And the third thing would be probably just opening up the f file, which is just generally useful. So I think this is probably the move I'll go for. I expect maybe knight to f5 from my opponent. Oh, sorry. My third reason was it opens up this bishop, which is useful. And you'll also see the reason that I over-defended the d4 pawn earlier on, with the 3 different pieces watching it, is that now my queen, I wanted to go and do something else, right? And I also have the opportunity to let one of the other pieces go and do something else as well. Like, let's say a move like knight to g5, going after the e6 pawn, and the d pawn would still be nicely defended. Again, there's no rush. You don't need to rush these positions. We have slow pressure on my opponent. We have a space advantage. My opponent has a clear weakness, right? And we can massage the position a bit. Bishop d3 is a very sophisticated move. Very interesting move. Just fighting for the light squares. I think that's a good move from my opponent. Also opens up the queen, which is maybe a bit useful for him. Also, I suppose, stops or tries to discourage the move bishop to b1 by taking control of this diagonal preemptively. So very interesting. We could play queen to c3, just putting the queen on a better square, defending d4, again, allowing these pieces to go do something else. And hitting the bishop, asking the bishop what it is going to do. I think bishop to f5 would probably be the move. In which case, I don't think I would take it. I think I'd leave it there for the time being. I think that makes the most sense. Let's go queen to c3. Of course, bishop b1 is playable, just offering a trade of bishops. But I also don't feel a need to rush that decision. This bishop, it's still useful on this diagonal applying pressure, I think. Because, as I said, this e6 pawn is definitely a weakness. And there may be some positions where I can win this e6 pawn, maybe for the cost of b2 or d4 or something like that. And at the end of the line, I may be able to take on d5 with check or something like that. So, there are potential tactics. Like, there may be some potentials where, like, my knight takes on e6 and the queen takes, and then I can take on d5, pinning the queen to the king. That's not completely ridiculous. That is a very real possibility. I think when you're like conceptualizing tactics, when you're thinking about the game of chess, I often say in my videos that the side with the more active pieces often has the tactics flow their way, right? But then that begs the question, what defines activity? Like, what is activity? I mean, there's different ways you could define that. You could define activity as the number of squares you control. You could say that this bishop is very active because it controls lots of different squares. And you could say this bishop is not very active because it doesn't control many squares, right? But you could also define activity as the value of the squares that you're controlling as well. So there's different things you can say. Queen a6 is a move I obviously saw that my opponent could play, just defending the bishop, but I don't think it's all that good. I like the look of the move knight to g5, trying to potentially overload the queen, and also, potentially setting up such tactics as I was talking about before. I can also consider the move bishop to g5, applying pressure to the dark squares around the king, which looks like a very reasonable idea. I could also play a move like queen to c5. Now the queen no longer controls this square, and say, okay, you're defending the bishop, but I don't care about the bishop anymore. I'm just going to apply general pressure to your position and put the queen on a more quote-unquote active square because it's looking at more weak squares. The queen doesn't necessarily see more squares on c5 than it does c3, but it sees more important squares. So if queen c5, I would assume knight to f5 would be the response. If I take the knight, probably bishop takes. And then I have a few options. I do have to be aware this queen could infiltrate into d3, which is maybe annoying. Okay, what else do I have? What was my issue with knight to g5? I think I was a little bit concerned about bishop to h6 ideas, because my bishop is a little bit weak on e3. If bishop to g5, knight to f5, take, the queen can no longer infiltrate, so that's useful. What can I do there? I don't know, but it looks active, and this knight still sucks, which is actually really important. Oh, okay. I think if I can keep this bishop on the g7 square by not allowing it to come to h6, by not blocking my bishop's control of h6, then it means this knight literally has no way forwards. This bishop could drop back to h8 to allow the knight into the game, but that seems like a very slow plan, and also a plan that could backfire tactically. So I'm liking the look of this move. Just a very active square for the bishop, and the d-pawn, it's not attacked by any of black's pieces, but even if it were to be, it's very well defended. If my opponent goes for a move like knight to c6, that's absolutely playable, applying pressure to d4. Worth noting, the knight has no more forward movement after it comes to c6, so we don't have to be too concerned. But my opponent does go for knight to f5 as anticipated, and I think we should snap that off immediately, because it's a good piece. And we'll see what my opponent takes with. He obviously has the choice of 4 different captures, bishop takes being the most natural. Now knight to h4 looks interesting, applying pressure to the bishop. We also have ideas of bishop to e7, and this rook is almost out of squares. Now, of course, I'd love to do bishop e7 and knight to g5, winning the exchange after rook to f7, except the bishop hangs. So you could consider a move like queen to c5 to try and preemptively defend the bishop. But again, queen c5, I don't like the look of the move queen to d3, invading my territory. If queen d3 and I get a queen trade, maybe that's a different story. Because a queen trade should probably benefit me, because I'm very active here. Okay. I could play a move like rook d2, defending this, controlling d3, and preparing queen to c5. With, again, this idea, which isn't ridiculous. Is not ridiculous. I think I like that idea, to be honest. Let's play it. Let's go rook d2. And just not do anything. Well, not do anything, but just improve our position slightly. Because my opponent is still very much back up against the wall. Okay, he goes bishop to e4. An interesting move, putting pressure on the knight. If bishop to e7, my opponent also now gives himself the f5 square for the rook. So, you know, not... that's a good move. That's a good move. I could, of course, bring my rook back to f2, which would suck to admit that I put it on the wrong square, but I also don't want to allow this to happen. I could move my knight, but then the question would be where? There's really no good squares, and also watch for that alignment. So I'm going to have to just admit that I misplaced the rook and bring the rook back. That's not the end of the world. I could argue that maybe the bishop is vulnerable on the e4 square to a knight to g5 idea, because an exchange like this would not be good for black, because it would open up my bishop immediately, not to even mention that it would ruin his pawn structure. It would be a passed pawn, but not particularly strong, because we control e3 very, very well. But okay, yeah, I think I misplaced my rook on the d2 square. Admittedly, I probably should have realized the importance of the f-file and just maintained my control over it, but this is chess. You make mistakes, and that's fine. That's not the end of the world whatsoever, and we learn. So, okay, I think one of the questions we have to ask is, where are these pieces going to be optimally placed? Ooh, that's an interesting move. Can I not just go queen to c8? Pinning the knight? If rook back, this is defended. This is also defended. But then I actually have bishop to e7, and black looks busted. This looks like a really strong move. I don't think I have to be too concerned about my opponent infiltrating, because I always have rook to f1. That's fine. But yeah, we're applying an awful lot of pressure with the queen now. And again, rook f8 is simply met with bishop to e7, which is a big problem. If king to f8, which might be the only move in the position, I mean, it's still not great. It's still not great, obviously. But that's also a move, though. That is a move, so good find. Queen c6, so of course he's now defending and offering me a queen trade. I don't necessarily have to allow the queen trade. I could move my queen somewhere, because this queen actually can't infiltrate along the c-file anywhere, because all of these squares are controlled by my pieces. However, if it moved like queen b8, take, I suppose this queen still can't go to c1. It still can't come in, even though the rook no longer defends c2, because the knight will just hang. So I could just stick around. If I move like a6, getting the pawn out of danger. I'm not sure what my follow-up is. I don't have knight to g4, which is the move I would like. I could trade, of course. Take, and claim the c-pawn is weak, which it probably is. Also allow knight c7 if I do that, though. Take. I don't have rook c2, which is frustrating. I could go for this maneuver. However, if take, bishop b3, c5, trying to go for like some kind of trade like this, maybe my pawns are very strong, but so are black's. That's difficult to evaluate. I don't have knight d2 ideas. Wait, what if take, knight d2, take, bishop d3, and then go for this? Bishop b3, if c5, it's still problematic. c5 is still very annoying. Bishop a4, king f7. I have bishop d8 controlling the movement of the knight, which is interesting. Do I have anything else? Trying to find something else, but I honestly think a queen trade is pretty much forced. I could, again, stick around with a move like queen d8 and try and just be annoying. I don't think it's that good, though. I think I'm just going to have to trade. It'll be really interesting to see the computer analysis on that decision and see what it thinks. Maybe now this is a good move. The idea being that I control this knight's only escape route, and I prepare knight to g5. If bishop to d8, c5... This pass pawn is actually very strong in that line. I like the look of the move bishop to d8. If rook to d7, then I can always play bishop to a5. That's a really good move. Trying to do this. That's a really good move. Completely missed that. Damn, I probably have to go king f1. King f1, bishop to e3 is still very annoying, though. Oof, that's really strong from my opponent. I should not have allowed that. Do I have to go back? Oh, wait, no. Can I do this? Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, knight g5 I think works. I think everything is just about held together. We're, of course, hitting the rook, but more importantly, we hit the weak e6 pawn. A trade of dark-squared bishops should probably favor me, because the bishop pair in this endgame should be incredibly strong. Okay, let's take. I'm also hitting his bishop, and damaging the pawn structure like this, I would win the e6 pawn at the end of the line. Okay, he goes knight to g7, defending e6, of course. I think I should snap off this bishop immediately. And then his pawn structure is completely ruined, and I have the bishop pair. I love the move g4 here. And it should be obvious why I love this move, because I don't want to allow this knight into the game whatsoever. I want to keep it completely locked out. That is a very good move from my opponent, though. He's finding some really strong moves. It's really annoying. Really annoying. Here, a4, he can't defend this, though. So that's okay. Oh no, he wins d4 at the end of that line. That's not good. Oh, that's really not good. Maybe... Oh no, this works. Bishop b2, king e3. I defend d4, and I save my a-pawn, and I'm going to win e4. I also maintain the pressure on e6, maintaining the immobilization of this knight. What I don't want to do is trade my bishop for the knight and then win e6, because although that looks like I'm winning a pawn, we go into an opposite color bishop endgame there, which is probably a draw. So let's take on e4. This knight still can't do anything. Completely locked away, which is great. And now I'm trying my pawn is on a light square here. My king is defending the dark squared pawns in the center. G4 is on a light square. H2 isn't very weak, but I can always move it. Well, here's a perfect time to move it onto a light square. And of course, take back on G4. Taking would be a horrible mistake because I need to keep the knight completely dominated by my pawn. And this is a very interesting endgame because I think white is clearly better. 1, we have a more active king, right? 2, we have a better pawn structure. And 3, we have the bishop pair. So, like, literally none of black's pawns can defend each other. Our center pawns can defend each other. And the other pawns are on light squares, meaning this bishop can't do a whole lot against them. And now we can try and start cleaning up the position. We can try and win this. Okay, the knight comes to e8. Can't come to c7. He may be stopping me from going to e7, though. But the knight can't do anything. I like the idea of getting my bishop around like this, maybe. I don't think there's a massive rush here to do anything incredible. Because the knight still can't move. Like, it can't come to c7, period. And I like keeping the bishop on d8 because it also prevents king to e7. Which means the king also can't really move. He may be trying to trade off the bishops now. However, if bishop e7, I probably play bishop to a5. There may be some lines where I do want to trade, but I'm not sure. It's a super interesting endgame. I like this move because this could be very difficult to defend. Here. I think I have d5 in that line. I don't think a bishop trade really benefits me. Because I want to keep this knight out of the game. Because if this knight like gets to d5 or something, then it's a great piece, which I don't want to allow. So this is good. Also, black's own pieces are blocking off his king's ability to get over to the queen side. Okay. c5 on the board. The move we were expecting. Taking, I don't think, is a good idea. I think we should push. I think we should push and create a passed pawn. Of course, black also has a passed pawn, but it's very weak. His knight still can't really do a whole lot. I suppose you could try and maneuver it into the e6 square via g7. But if knight to g7, I probably have bishop to c8, maintaining my dominance of the knight's movement. And then, you know, a7 might fall, c5 might fall, those kinds of things, and this king still can't really get involved. Which, I mean, I love the look of this, right? Let's go bishop c8. I don't want the knight to get into the game. I'm trying the absolute best I can to keep it out of the game. It may be fine to allow it into the game, but I think my bishop pair, and I mean, look how active my pieces are compared to my opponent's pieces, should win me the game in the long run. The king can't come close because we dominate the movement. That's fine. There's quite a few options here. This is something I'm looking at because these two squares look important. Also aware of this sort of thing, but I'm not sure it's amazing. I also don't think there's a massive rush. So let's start with bishop c7. I could even consider going a5, a6 just to get the pawn on a very scary square. And then I suppose I even have moves like bishop c6, sorry, bishop b6, and after takes a7, you won't be able to stop promotion. That looks like a winning idea. And of course, if this pawn goes to a6, I just snap it. If the pawn goes to a5, I snap it. There's also no knight to e6 if you distract this bishop, because the king no longer defends the e6 square, and I'll just take the knight. So the knight still can't move. The knight still has no squares, which, again, is very important. And I suppose one of the benefits of allowing this pawn to come to c5 is that this bishop is actually just tied down to the defense of the pawn. This bishop is occupied by my king, which is a pretty good trade. I also, should mention that bishop b8 might not be the best move because of king to d8 going after this bishop. So I think just pushing is good. Bishop f8 doesn't really do anything. So let's just push. I don't think my opponent really has moves or a plan of action. So this is, it should be completely winning. Just a5, a6, bishop to b6. And then you either give me these pawns or I just promote. So I love the look of this position. I hope that this, the game in general and the endgame in particular have been very instructive. It's not over just yet, but it's getting there. We can throw in the move e6 in this position. If king to f6, bishop to d8, bishop to e7, take, we could go ahead and win c5. I think the point of king to f7... Wait, what is the point? Knight to e8, I assume? Okay. That's not particularly scary, though. There's probably several wins here, but I am aware my time is getting a little bit low, so I just want to play a move. Bishop d6 is also probably completely winning. But I, again, think this idea is very nice, very aesthetic, and also just completely winning. Well, actually, I do have to be a little bit concerned about knight to e8, bishop to b6 takes a7, and knight to c8 defending. I would have king c6 in those lines, but there's no need to allow counterplay like that. Because, if I'm going to give up a bishop, then I should be absolutely sure that I'm winning. If knight to e8, I can just go bishop to b8 instead, and you literally can't defend a7. I can pick that up, I'll pick up c5, and I'll promote this pawn regardless. So again, no need to overcomplicate things at all. No need. I will have to be aware if knight to e8, bishop to b8, if I take, there is knight to c7 check. So I may have to set the position up a little bit more before I go ahead and commit. But yeah, knight to e8, bishop b8. The knight still can't do anything. It can just go back to g7 and that's it. I love the way I'm dominating this knight here. I think it's really instructive. And hopefully it's instructive for you guys. Very satisfying for me as well to be able to play in this way. And yeah, I think this is very nice. And like I've been saying for the past, I don't know, 5 or maybe 10 moves, there's not a massive rush here. Having the bishop pair should be enough to convert this position against the bishop and the knight with my activity. Yeah, okay. Knight to e8. I could give this check and then go bishop to e5, but why give him the f6 square? Let's just drop back. My opponent still can't really do anything, and he still needs to be aware of this. There's probably some lines where I can go bishop to d7 and trade and then take. Also, part of the reason I put my pawn on a6 is so this bishop can never touch it. Because my pawns being on light squares are, completely safe from this bishop. And because we're dominating this knight's movement, I don't have to be so concerned about the knight being able to see them. And even if it can in many lines, I can at the very least trade it off for a bishop. Well, ideally my light squared bishop. Because if I trade off my dark squared bishop for the knight, I may have an opposite color bishop endgame, which I cannot win. Which, of course, I don't want to allow, because this should be completely winning. So, okay. Let's see what my opponent does. Of course, I can't take this just yet, because knight to c... Well, no, knight c7 doesn't pick up the pawn, because it's defended. It does allow the knight into the game, though, maybe? Okay, bishop g7. This is defended, so I really don't see a reason not to take this. Okay, that's fine. I guess I just move back. Or I can take. I don't really want to allow this, though. What else is there? King c6? King d8? Bishop to d6? Sorry, to d7. That looks pretty good. I'm also just getting my king onto a square where it can't be checked because of the diagonal, like one diagonal space between the knight and the king. Common geometric pattern. And of course, I'm on a light square, so the bishop can't check me. This should be game over because the knight has no moves still. And this is still defended by my bishop. And I think I have a very simple threat of taking the knight and just playing king to b7. And I pick up a second pawn. Okay, g5. All right, then. If this, then this. Check, king here. Well, no, a7 is completely winning. If here... No, it's completely winning, yeah. I was just checking there's no way that the black pieces could set up a blockade by coming to c7 and defending a8. But no, it should be fine. Okay, he goes for this. I don't think it works, though. Bishop b6. Bishop e5 is forced. Just a7, and that's game over. Because the knight is pinned to the king. If the king moves, then I win the knight. And you see the insane power of the bishop pair just completely dominating the black pieces. The bishop pair is so good because it just coordinates so well with each other. Like, they just control all the squares between themselves. And okay, yeah, game over. That is very promising looking. Yeah, let's go get into the game review. See what the computer has to say. 90.9% accuracy. That is not bad. Not bad whatsoever. My opponent with 82.8. It looks like we had a bit of a bigger advantage in the middle game. And then I let it slip a bit. And then I think the end game was completely winning. But let's dive into this position. Okay, so... Of course, we start with the Sicilian Defense, and I go for a3. Here, I'm intending, after the most natural move, knight to c6, to gambit a pawn on b4, and get some very, very interesting positions. My win rate is like 70% or something mental from this position. But my opponent goes knight to f6. And I'm well aware that e5 is the best move, but personally, I mentioned this in the game, right? I just don't particularly like these positions. I find them a little bit uncomfortable to play. So I prefer knight to c3 and just go for a structure that I know. Now, here I was expecting the move d5. And I knew I had a few options. On e5, knight e4, we could maybe take. We can maybe play knight c to e2? What, trying to go d3? That's... Okay, I would never see that, to be totally honest. I mean, even a move like knight to f3 should be playable. And this trade is probably good for white, because we open up the d-file, we open up the bishop. This looks very comfortable. But of course, taking is also completely reasonable. On d5 as well, I thought I potentially had ideas to do this. And there is bishop d7, and if knight here, bishop b5... Oh, I don't know why I thought I had bishop to f4, because not only does my bishop is not open, but my knight is also hanging, so I'm not really sure why I thought that. But this is also playable. You can play a move like queen to h5, bishop c4, knight to f3. If bishop c4, are you supposed to take with a d-pawn? No, there's a... What? Oh, there's an insane move here for white. Try and find it. It's actually pretty cool. Queen f3. because you don't want a queen trade, and this knight no longer has a way out of the position. So if like e6, which is the best move, then you take now, develop the bishop, develop the knight, get the rook in. That's really nice. But my opponent went d6. I went bishop c4, and we adopt the Vienna structure. g6, d3, bishop g7, and f4. Of course, a3 is on the board, so it's not a pure Vienna, but a3 is always a useful move to be able to drop the bishop back to a2, which of course we did in the game. And if, you know, this pawn were to be on e5, then this would very much be a Vienna type structure. So I like the way that I can bring my openings together by playing similar setups against different openings. And it's something I'd highly recommend you guys do as well. My opponent castles, knight to f3, knight c6, castles, and e6, you pretty much always meet with bishop to a2. Now, the computer likes to move like king to h1, for example, but after d5, the computer wants to drop back and go for this sort of position, which just, you know, let's say you get a queen trade. The computer thinks it's mildly better for white, but I want to attack my opponent. So by dropping my bishop back after d5, I can just go e5. And I can boot the knight, and then we can continue playing, which is pretty much what happened in the game. We did a little bit of maneuvering, d5 was played, e5 was played, knight back to e8, and now our position is very, very comfortable. I go c3, one of the better moves in the position, preparing d4, rook c8 and d4. Computer interestingly preferred rook to f2, a move that I of course played later. cd4, cd4, bishop b5, and now, yes, rook to f2, the computer is a massive fan of, for all the reasons that I explained earlier in the game. Queen b6, I go bishop to e3. It doesn't love that, it prefers b3. Really? Well, okay, this is very strange. It really wants to play the move a4 and try and boot this bishop away. But the computer likes bishop a6, a4, f6. I'm not even... Oh, and it wants bishop to a3. Ah. It thinks this is the best diagonal for the bishop. Which does make sense, actually. Because these are all very important squares. Very interesting idea. Very interesting idea. But okay, I went bishop to e3. And I suppose we did see in the game my bishop wasn't all that good. So it does make sense. f6, not the best move, because it doesn't really threaten anything. Now watch the evaluation bar. Watch what happens if I take. Yeah? Do not take. Like, it does not help you whatsoever. You can go, oh, e6 is really weak. Yeah, but like, so are your pawns. And black's pieces are now activating. How are you going to exploit e6? You're not. You're not. So I went rook c1. Again, it wants a4. But I did not see this move, and it wants this b3 idea, which, yeah, I think it probably wants to still reroute the bishop, which is pretty funny. But I go rook c1, which is perfectly reasonable. fe5 is a mistake. Ah, so it actually does prefer de5. Hitting the queen, which I saw, but I dismissed as an idle threat. Let's say queen c7. Okay, then rook c2. Cool. What about queen d8? Knight e2, and it wants to put the knight on d4, I assume. Wow, this is a... Okay, and bishop h6. Knight ed4. This is defended. Bishop d7. I suppose, yeah, white kind of takes over the game. You allow a passed pawn, but because you have such good control over d4, you can just stick a knight there, and it's a really, really good knight. Okay, but fe5 is, of course, still very good. Bishop d3 is the best move, and my opponent finds it. So I did think after he played it, like, that is a really good move. Fair play. I went queen c3, which is the best response. Just hitting the bishop, asking what it's doing. If it goes to a square like f5, I can chop it. I can go bishop g5. I have many, many options. Bishop g5 immediately doesn't make sense because the knight will just come to f5 and you'll see the evaluation drop immediately. Whereas if queen c3, bishop f5, bishop to g5, the knight doesn't have the option of coming here. It can come to c6, but as I explained in the game, it isn't as good on c6 as it is on f5. Simply, it can only see d4 and d4 is defended. So it's just more restricted. Whereas on f5, it sees many important squares. So my opponent defends. Bishop g5 is not the best move. h3 apparently is, which, okay, I'm just never seeing. It also likes bishop to b3. With what intention? Let's say black just plays knight c6. What's the point? Bishop c2. Just really wants to get rid of this bishop, which does make sense, but okay. Bishop g5, knight f5. I take, bishop takes, rook d2, which is a mistake. Okay. A better move was bishop b3, which is something I was contemplating, trying to bring the bishop to c2. Or even, I suppose, d1 is fine to maybe go on this diagonal and reroute itself. But yeah, I went rook d2. My opponent went bishop e4, and I was like, oh, I actually just have to come straight back. And it is the best move to just come straight back. You've got to admit when you're wrong sometimes. And rook to f7 played, which is a really good move, apparently. Queen c8, queen c6 is basically the only defensive resource. And taking is the best option. I was considering moves like queen b8, but I just couldn't figure out what my actual threat was. Computer likes bishop to f8, unpinning the knight. I can take, but like, this just looks scary. I win a pawn, but my queen is completely out the game. I can't get back into the game. And what have I achieved? So I took on c6, which is good. And I should have gone immediately for knight d2, which I, of course, saw initially. But I thought I could do better. I thought I could go bishop to d8 first, which I just can't. I just can't. Bishop h6 is apparently a miss, though, because I have knight to g5. Everything else loses, basically. I have to put a piece on g5. If king to f1, I rejected this on the basis of bishop to e3. And I was like, well, after this, there's just bishop d3. And I lose. Or I just lose d4. Like, everything falls. So what I should have done is knight to d2. I saw this. This. Bishop d3. I have king e3, bishop b5. And then I can bring the knight back. And yeah, I'm just dominant. Knight c7. Bishop b1. If anyone's better, it's white. Because I just have more activity, more space, more control. I like the look of move b4 here. Why is that not good? Wait, what? Why is this so bad? Oh, a3 is compromised. Oh, okay, yes, that makes sense. That makes sense. I like b4 because it stops c5, but I suppose e5 is well defended, so I don't have to be concerned. Anyway, we go knight g5, rook f2, king f2, knight g7. And that just baffled me. It really did baffle me. Because I thought, well, surely you just move the bishop. Like, why wouldn't you just move the bishop? Okay, I suppose you're gonna... Well, I mean, I suppose you're gonna lose the e6 pawn, to be fair. The computer comes up with bishop c2, and if knight e6, knight g7, it thinks that black can maybe hold, but this is not a very human way to play. Knight g7, of course, we snap on e4, and g4 is by far the best move in this position, because we restrict the black knight completely. Bishop c1, a4 is the best move. Bishop b2 and king e3 is the only move. We have to defend this, and we're going to go win this. King f7, king e4, h5. The computer does like taking, but I think it's far simpler to just play h3. It also, I think, comes up with this idea of a5 and bishop to b6. Yeah, it comes up with this idea now. I didn't see this at the time, of course, if takes... Oh, wait, no, you can't. You have to take like this. Why does this not work? Oh, the knight can get back. Interesting. But okay, it's unnecessary. h3 is far easier. hg4, hg4, knight e8. And yeah, bishop c4, getting the bishop on an active diagonal. Bishop a3. There's really no rush here. Like, black can't do anything. Computer does like trading. And it thinks that after takes king f4, we can get involved. But bishop a5 is slightly better, because black just can't move. c5 and d5 is by far the best move, because taking makes no sense. This is almost drawing, because now a7 is protected. This bishop is active, And the knight is still kind of stuck, sure, but how am I actually going to break through? My king has no way into the position. By playing d5, I force a trade on d5, and my king plants itself on such an active square, defending so many things, making so many threats. And as we saw in the game, it just marched straight into the position and won us the game. So knight g7, trying to come into e6, so I just stop that with bishop to c8. The computer wants king c6, but like, this is a very human way to play, and easier to play. King e8, bishop c7, stopping the king from doing anything, defending e5, preparing to push the pawn. Bishop f8, I push. King f7, I push. Knight to e8, bishop to b8, maintaining my control of this knight. I was considering, well, maybe bishop b6, and after takes, king c6, stopping this. And it does work. Admittedly, it does work. But why am I risking that? There's just no point. One miscalculation and it's game over. And I'm low on time. So just play the simple move. Bishop g7, king c5, king e7, king c6. I saw that black wanted to do this, but I thought I could just bring the bishop back. The knight has no moves because g7 is occupied. g5 played by my opponent. I mean, my opponent has no moves. Literally can't do anything. There are no moves. If king e7, I'll just take. You're still in a ton of trouble. If here, then check, and here, and I can take and just promote. So I take knight c7, bishop b6, bishop e5, and just a7. And black is in zugzwang. Black is in zugzwang. If he moves his king, he loses the knight. If he moves his bishop, then I'll just promote. And this is still pinned. So, you know, something like this, I can promote. And obviously, this is completely game over. There's many, many ways to win. So, yeah, I played a7. No. Sorry, my opponent took on e5? When did he resign? Oh, I think I did play a7 and then my opponent resigned. So, a very interesting game. I hope you guys enjoyed and can see why I love the Vienna setup so much. Also, you know, the areas where I went wrong and where I could have improved. Very important for both me to learn and you guys to learn from. If you want to see another game where I use this Vienna setup against the Sicilian, let me remind you what that is. I use this exact setup against the Sicilian in the video that is going to appear here, so make sure you check that out if you're interested. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.